want you to believe this was simple. A normal pregnancy. A happy royal moment. But nothing about this story ever stayed still. Not the details, not the emotions, not even the timeline. From the very beginning, something felt staged. Not fake, just performed.
Meghan Markle's surrogacy scandal has entered the mainstream media domain.
Did you think it was a parody? Because I thought that this was AI. I thought this cannot be real.
The reason I didn't think it was AI is because it looks like the stomach is fake, where the baby, I swear that's the first thing I thought.
And this is from a woman who attacks her father mercilessly in the series.
Meghan at the Albert Hall. How many weeks pregnant was she supposed to be? Was it about 8 weeks? And she looks as if she's at least 5 months.
According to public narrative, the Duchess of Drama has managed to make one of the most natural experiences in life, pregnancy, sound like a Netflix anthology. And honestly, that line alone says everything. Pregnancy, one of the oldest, most universal human experiences, somehow turned into episodic storytelling. Different chapters, different moods, different emotions depending on where you are watching from. One platform gave you glowing serenity. Another handed you near tragedy. And the audience left dizzy trying to remember which version they heard last.
Told the world she was a fraud. Perhaps we should have all listened.
And that ridiculous story about how they first met. The whole thing was a tissue of inaccuracies.
One episode, it's all glowing motherhood and avocado toast. The next, it's a near tragic ordeal that no one could ever understand. Even her biggest supporters whisper that the story keeps changing faster than the British weather. That's when the whispers started. Quiet ones at first. Supporters leaning in and saying, wait, didn't she say something different before? Not accusations, just confusion. And confusion is dangerous because once people feel lost, they start retracing steps. Sources close to royal watchers joke that tracking Meghan's pregnancy timeline requires a PhD in plot twists. And that's not cruelty, that's exhaustion. People trying to line up dates, appearances, interviews, and suddenly realizing the puzzle pieces don't come from the same box. One minute, she's nesting peacefully. The next, she's unpacking trauma years later.
That any doctor on this earth would allow a woman with a geriatric pregnancy, high risk, and with 2 epidurals to leave the hospital within an hour of giving birth, which means that the doctors would have had to deliver Archie, spank his ass, wipe Meghan Markle, put her on a van or whatever, and just send her off without testing to see whether there was any nerve damage, because epidurals do that.
And right in the center of this spinning narrative stands one man who never shouts, never accuses, never points, he just documents. 1 minute, she's nesting in the sunshine. The next, she's recalling trauma that apparently surfaced years later. And right in the middle of this narrative roller coaster stands Tom Bower, the biographer who never calls her out directly. And that ridiculous story about how they first met, the whole thing was a tissue of inaccuracy to be polite, yet somehow leaves the audience clutching their teacups in disbelief. That's the genius of it. He doesn't tell you what to think. He shows you what doesn't sit right. And lets the silence do the damage. Bower doesn't accuse, he documents. He quietly highlights the details that don't sit right and lets viewers draw their own conclusions. Because sometimes the most devastating exposure isn't what's said, it's what's left unsaid. And when it comes to Meghan's pregnancy story, let's just say, according to Bower's research, there's more mystery than maternity. And then something shifts. But what he uncovered next made even the palace whisper. Wait, that doesn't add up. From the outside, everything looked flawless. Designer dresses, carefully lit interviews, a glowing duchess carrying a royal air. But behind the polish, the story kept evolving. Public observers noticed that her tone seemed to shift with each new platform. On one show, she was playful, joking about late-night cravings. On another, she described emotional turmoil and fear. Then came the podcast episode where she spoke about trauma that allegedly changed her forever. It wasn't one story. It was several versions wearing the same crown. And Bower didn't need to say the word inconsistent. He simply placed them side by side and let the contrast scream. It wasn't one story. It was several competing versions dressed in the same crown. Tom Bower, ever the quiet investigator, doesn't shout inconsistency. He simply places the stories side by side and lets the gaps speak louder than accusations ever could.
The doctor talks about both the the children. And listen to what she says.
So you tell me to tell you something that maybe a dozen people actually know that's going to come out very soon. Okay. Meghan Markle, the reason why you watch her interviews and she just seems off. She's owned by a pharmaceutical company. The 2 children that she had, they're not hers. She didn't have them with Harry. And how her and Harry met is that she's a...
And then came the physical details. The kind that people remember because bodies don't rewrite themselves easily. They were like, I just saw this picture I'd forgotten about when you were so pregnant with Archie. I mean, I gained 65 lbs with both pregnancies. Oh my god, you're so tiny. And you're in these 5, and I always just wear my 5 in pointy-toed stilettos. People weren't being cruel, they were being confused, the math wasn't mathing, the visuals didn't align with lived experience, and when timelines start wobbling, credibility follows. And as his notes begin to connect the dots, one thing becomes disturbingly clear. The pregnancy story may have changed, but the questions it raised never did. Then the dates fell apart. Public discussions turned into detective boards, screenshots, circles, comparisons. According to public discussion, the dates surrounding her announcements, appearances, and supposed due periods feel like puzzle pieces from 3 different boxes. And Bauer noticed something subtle but lethal, the way the dates bent just enough to fit the mood. But it's not that the dates are wrong, it's that they seem soft, bending just enough to match the mood of the moment. And when medical details entered the chat, the disbelief got louder. There is no way on earth that any doctor on this earth would allow a woman with a geriatric pregnancy, high risk, and with 2 epidurals to leave the hospital within an hour of giving birth. Again, Bauer never says lie. He just shows how recollections this dramatic don't usually swing so wildly. His writing implies a
anecdotal experience with my wife, who was very, very large during pregnancy. The idea of her moving like that would have been impossible. She just couldn't have done it. So, she was pale, she was swollen, she was very large at the time. The idea of her getting low like that, I just don't know if she physically could have done it. So it is shocking to me. It does look very strange.
If the children were born that way, it would mean that Archie and Lily were no longer to be allowed.
Narrative reconstruction, as though each retelling was edited to match her public image at that particular time. Early version, radiant, later version, endangered hero. Each one perfectly timed. And then came the emotional rebrand. By the time Meghan began speaking publicly about her pregnancies again, something had clearly shifted, not in the story, but in the emotion. Emotion became currency. Vulnerability became choreography. Tom Bauer, ever the biographer of contradictions, observed how emotion became Meghan's most strategic tool. And the silences, those were louder than anything she said. For every emotional detail shared in interviews, there's another moment she avoids entirely. Bauer calls it restraint, others call it strategy. Either way, the gaps became magnets for speculation. Those gaps, Tom Bauer suggests, are where the real intrigue lives. And here is where his brilliance lands. He never destroys, he arranges. Tom Bauer doesn't shout, he doesn't accuse, he simply arranges facts and lets the silence between them do the heavy lifting. By the end, the revelation isn't medical, it's psychological. The shocking truth was never the pregnancy, it was the pattern. Stories adapting, retellings remixing. One experience refracted into multiple emotional outcomes. It's not a lie, he suggests. It's a strategy, and that's why the story never ends. Because it doesn't need answers, it needs attention. In the digital age, a mystery doesn't need to be solved. It just needs to stay alive. Meghan speaks, Bauer observes, the internet combusts, silence follows, and the cycle repeats. Because in this saga, silence isn't absence, it's fuel. And that's the most unsettling part of all. Not what was said, not what was questioned, but how effortlessly the story keeps changing shape and how impossible it has become to look away. And just when you think the audience has finally caught up, just when it feels like every version has been heard, every clip replayed, every timeline dragged through comment sections, the story refuses to settle. That's the unsettling brilliance of it. Nothing ever lands. Nothing ever closes. It just morphs. Because once people stop asking what happened, they start asking why why it keeps changing. And that question is far more dangerous. You can feel it in the way viewers talk now. Not angrily, not even mockingly, but cautiously. Like people who've watched the same movie too many times and suddenly realize the ending is different every rewatch. Same scenes, same characters, different emotional punch. And that's where suspicion quietly replaces sympathy. What really rattles longtime observers isn't a single inconsistency, it's the rhythm of them. The way each new retelling arrives right when the narrative needs a reset. When criticism peaks, vulnerability enters. When fatigue sets in, empowerment takes center stage. When attention drifts, trauma resurfaces. It's not chaotic, it's timed. And timing is never accidental. People began noticing how emotion arrived before facts. Tears first, details later. And when details finally came, they felt selective. Carefully framed, never quite anchored. And that's when silence became the loudest character in the room. Because silence isn't empty here, it's curated. Strategic pauses where basic questions should live. Hospital specifics, clear timelines. Straight answers that never quite arrive, not because they're hidden, but because they're redirected. Smoothed over with warmth, with relatability, with another emotional beat that shifts focus away from logistics and back to feeling. And feelings are powerful. Feelings disarm, they soften skepticism, they make people feel cruel for questioning. That's the genius, whether intentional or instinctive. By the time someone asks, wait, but how does that work? They already feel guilty for asking at all. Tom Bauer understands that psychology better than most. That's why he never fights emotion with accusation. He fights it with order, dates, quotes, sequences. He lays them out quietly, almost politely, and steps aside. No conclusions, no verdict, just a subtle suggestion that the pieces don't lock the way they should. And the audience does the rest. That's why his work lingers. It doesn't demand belief, it invites comparison. And comparison is lethal to carefully managed narratives. Because once people compare, they stop consuming passively. They start remembering. Remembering that the glowing yoga-loving mother didn't sound anything like the later woman describing near catastrophe. Remembering that timelines once spoken confidently later became vague. Remembering that physical descriptions don't easily reconcile with lived experience shared by millions of other women who've been there. And when those memories collide, discomfort sets in. Not outrage, discomfort. The kind that makes people lean back and say, something here isn't lining up and I can't unsee it now. What's fascinating is how the story survives because of this discomfort. Each unanswered question feeds another video, another podcast, another reaction clip dissecting tone, posture, phrasing. The narrative becomes crowdsourced. No longer controlled by interviews or statements, but by perception, by pattern recognition. And patterns don't care about intent, they just exist. That's why defenders and skeptics talk past each other. One side sees evolution, growth, emotional processing over time. The other sees revision, refinement, narrative tuning. And both sides can pull clips to support their view because the story has supplied all of them. That's the paradox. The same openness that makes the narrative feel intimate also makes it unstable. Too many versions weaken the anchor. Too many emotional angles erode trust. And once trust starts slipping, no amount of vulnerability can glue it back together. Because vulnerability only works when people believe it's spontaneous, not scheduled. And the final irony, the more the story is defended, the more it spreads. Every denial amplifies it. Every emotional explanation refreshes it. Every silence fuels it. The narrative has become self-sustaining, a loop of attention that no longer requires new information to survive. That's why it hasn't ended. That's why it won't. Not because there's a secret waiting to be exposed, but because the story itself has become the spectacle, a case study in modern myth-making, in how emotion, timing, and selective detail can keep a single event alive far longer than facts ever could. And maybe that's the real takeaway Tom Bauer leaves behind quietly without saying it outright. That truth doesn't always collapse under lies. Sometimes it dissolves under too many versions of sincerity. Sometimes the danger isn't deception, but over-curation. Because when everything is framed, filtered, and emotionally optimized, people stop asking what's real and start asking what's being managed. And once that question enters the room, it never leaves. The story doesn't end with a revelation, it ends with a lingering doubt. A doubt that reshapes every future interview, every pause, every carefully chosen word. And in that sense, the most powerful thing Bauer ever did wasn't expose a moment, it was expose a method that keeps the world watching, keeps the debate alive, keeps the silence heavy. Because in this saga, silence isn't the absence of truth. It's the engine that keeps the story breathing, story breathing, story breathing, story breathing.